Something is on fire in the Strait of Hormuz. Not just a tanker, not just steel and crude oil worth tens of millions of dollars, something far harder to replace and far more important to the stability of the world you live in every single day. The belief, the foundational, decades-old belief, that American power is the one force on Earth that cannot be effectively challenged. That belief is burning too. And what's remarkable isn't that it happened. What's remarkable is how quietly the world has started adjusting to the fact that it did. A commercial oil tanker, insured, flagged, operating on routes that Washington had publicly described as protected, was struck by Iranian drone systems and set ablaze in one of the most strategically vital waterways on the planet. Western media covered it in a paragraph, then moved on. But the governments of every major economy on Earth did not move on. Their intelligence agencies, their central banks, their energy ministries, they are all running the same calculation right now. And the answer they keep arriving at is making a lot of very powerful people very uncomfortable. This is the story of what actually happened, why it matters to you personally regardless of where you live, and what it tells us about a global order that may be shifting faster than any headline is willing to admit. To understand the scale of what's at stake, you have to understand what the Strait of Hormuz actually is. Not in abstract geopolitical terms, but in raw physical reality. It is a narrow strip of water wedged between Iran and Oman. At its tightest point, the navigable channel is barely 33 kilometers wide, 2 lanes of traffic in each direction, like a highway interchange connecting continents. And through that highway, every single day, flows approximately 20% of the entire world's oil supply, roughly 17 million barrels of crude oil, every single day. That oil doesn't stay in the Gulf. It powers cars in Manchester and Birmingham. It heats homes in Toronto and Montreal. It fuels the factories and logistics networks that keep supermarket shelves stocked across the American Midwest. It drives the manufacturing economies of Germany, Japan, South Korea, and India. The Strait of Hormuz is not a regional waterway with regional consequences. It is a global economic artery, and every government on the planet knows it. For the better part of 8 decades, the United States Navy has positioned itself as the guardian of that artery. The argument was elegant in its simplicity. American naval dominance keeps the corridor open. American security guarantees give shipping companies the confidence to move oil without hesitation. American military presence is what stands between orderly global energy markets and catastrophic disruption. Remove the American security umbrella, the argument went, and the entire supply chain begins to unravel. That was the theory. The reality unfolding in 2025 and into 2026 looks considerably more complicated, because Iran spent years, not months, not weeks, but years, quietly building a military capability designed for exactly one purpose: not to defeat America in a conventional war. That would be suicidal. But to make the cost of American intervention so high, so unpredictable, and so politically painful that Washington would eventually have to recalculate whether maintaining dominance in this specific theater was worth the price. And that strategy is now being tested in real time. The strikes on commercial shipping weren't random acts of aggression. They were calibrated moves in a strategy that Iran has been refining for over a decade. A tanker carrying crude oil valued at tens of millions of dollars struck by drone systems and set ablaze sends a message that no press release ever could. It tells insurance companies, shipping executives, and energy traders something simple and devastating: the guarantee has limits. Insurance companies responded immediately. Lloyd's of London and other major maritime insurers began reassessing war risk premiums across the entire Gulf region. Shipping routes that had been standard operating procedure for decades suddenly carried financial uncertainty attached to them. And what happens when maritime insurers raise their premiums? Shipping companies raise their rates to cover the added cost. When shipping rates rise, the cost of moving oil rises. When oil movement costs rise, import prices climb. When import prices climb, energy costs increase. When energy costs increase, inflation picks up. And when inflation picks up, a family in Leeds paying their monthly gas bill, or a family in Ohio filling up their truck, feels the consequence of a conflict happening thousands of miles away in waters they've probably never thought about. This is how modern asymmetric conflict reaches into your home without anyone firing a shot near your front door. It travels through supply chains, it arrives as a number on a bill, it shows up at the petrol station where the price per liter or per gallon tells a story about geopolitics that no news anchor bothered to explain. The people making strategic decisions in Washington and Tehran are not the ones paying that price. Ordinary households are. And that dynamic, where the cost of conflict is felt most sharply by people who have the least influence over it, is one of the defining injustices of the current moment. But the insurance premiums and shipping disruptions were only the beginning of what would become a much more alarming strategic picture. Here is where the situation shifts from economically disruptive to strategically alarming. Advanced American drone systems, representing the cutting edge of unmanned military technology, the product of billions in research and development and years of operational refinement, were being neutralized over the strait. Not on one occasion, not as an anomaly, repeatedly, and with enough consistency to force a genuine reassessment inside the American defense establishment. Iran's asymmetric warfare doctrine has always rested on a specific and ruthless logic. You don't need to match your opponent's power, you need to make their power expensive enough to use that the political will to use it eventually collapses. Drone swarms are cheap to produce, cheap to replace, and require minimal infrastructure. The drones targeting American assets in the Gulf cost a fraction of a percent of the assets they're targeting. The math is brutal, and it favors the side spending less. Every time a cheap drone contributes to neutralizing an expensive system, the exchange rate of the conflict shifts against the technologically superior power, and then the reports surfaced about the F-35. For anyone not steeped in military affairs, the significance of this aircraft is difficult to overstate. The F-35 Lightning II is not just a fighter jet, it is the single most expensive weapons program in human history, a project that has consumed somewhere north of $400 billion across its development and procurement cycle, with lifetime costs projected to exceed $1 trillion. It is the centerpiece of American air power doctrine. It is the aircraft around which Allied air forces in Europe, Asia, and the Pacific have structured their own defense planning. When Japan, South Korea, the United Kingdom, and Australia commit to buying F-35s, they are making a bet that American air power doctrine is sound and that this specific machine represents the future of aerial warfare. Reports suggesting that an F-35 operating in the Gulf theater had been effectively compromised sent a shockwave through defense analytical communities that the mainstream press largely failed to capture. Because the implication was not just tactical, it was strategic. If the world's most sophisticated stealth aircraft is vulnerable in a real combat environment to systems that Iran has developed or acquired, every nation running Air Force calculations needs to revise them. Every allied government that bet its security on the F-35's invulnerability needs to revisit that bet. And every rival government that has been wondering whether to test American resolve has just received a data point that pushes them toward action rather than caution. Iran didn't invent asymmetric warfare. Strategists and academics have written about this cost exchange problem for decades. The concern was well documented. But there is a profound difference between reading about asymmetric vulnerability in a policy paper and watching it operate in real time against the world's most powerful military. The paper becomes reality, and reality has consequences that theory never fully captures. In the middle of escalating military pressure, the United States made a public statement so unusual, so historically jarring, that it required several readings to fully absorb. American leadership openly floated the idea that coalition partners should consider joining a collective effort to assert control over Iranian energy reserves, to claim and redistribute Iran's oil as a strategic objective. Read that again, slowly. This is not a classified memo uncovered by investigative journalists. This is not a back-channel diplomatic position that leaked through an anonymous source. This is a sitting American administration openly discussing the seizure of a sovereign nation's natural resources as a foreign policy option. In public, on the record, through official channels. For generations, American foreign policy, however aggressive in practice, however nakedly self-interested in outcome, operated within a framework of institutional language. There were UN resolutions, coalition frameworks, doctrines of humanitarian intervention, legal justifications that maintained at least the appearance of operating within international norms. Even when the underlying interests were purely strategic, the framing was careful. That layer of institutional packaging provided cover for allies to participate without being seen as enablers of naked resource extraction. That framework did not survive this statement. And the global reaction, particularly from nations across Africa, Latin America, the Middle East, and Southeast Asia, was immediate, pointed, and almost entirely absent from Western mainstream coverage. Countries that had been carefully neutral, that had avoided taking sides in the growing US-Iran confrontation, found the framing clarified for them in a way that no amount of diplomacy could undo. The argument that American power in the Gulf is about freedom of navigation, about international law, about the security of global energy markets, that argument became significantly harder to sustain the moment the seizure of another country's oil was discussed as a legitimate policy option in public. The consequences of that statement are still unfolding. But one of its most immediate effects was to accelerate something that was already in motion, something that the Western press has almost entirely failed to cover adequately. While Washington was calling for international solidarity and framing the situation in the Gulf as a test of the rules-based international order, something else was happening in the background. Countries that received Washington's call for coalition support, some of them American partners, some of them NATO-adjacent economies with deep security ties to the United States, quietly began opening their own channels to Tehran. Not noisily, not defiantly, quietly, as a matter of insurance. transactions denominated in Chinese yuan rather than US dollars, oil purchased through bilateral arrangements that bypass the dollar-based clearing systems that Washington relies on to enforce financial pressure, supply agreements structured to reduce exposure to American sanctions architecture. These are not fringe developments happening in economically marginal countries. These are structural shifts being made by significant economies, and they point directly at the most important financial mechanism of the post-war American order, the petrodollar system. To understand why this matters at a level that affects your savings, your pension, and your cost of living, you need to understand what the petrodollar actually is and why it has been so central to American power. In the early 1970s, in the aftermath of the collapse of Bretton Woods, the gold-backed international monetary system, the United States negotiated a series of agreements, most prominently with Saudi Arabia, that established a convention. Global oil would be priced and traded in US dollars, not because the US dollar had any particular intrinsic connection to oil, but because that convention created an enormous, self-reinforcing global demand for dollars. Every country that needs to import oil, which is essentially every country, needs to acquire US dollars to do so. That demand is structural and persistent. It means that regardless of American trade deficits, regardless of the national debt, regardless of domestic economic policy, there is always a floor of global demand for dollars. That floor is what allows the United States to run fiscal deficits that would cripple any other country's currency. It is what makes American financial sanctions so extraordinarily powerful. If you need dollars to buy oil, and the United States controls access to the dollar system, American financial leverage is nearly inescapable. Nearly. The qualifier is doing a lot of work in that sentence, because the entire architecture of dollar dominance rests on the convention being universal. The moment enough countries start conducting oil transactions outside the dollar system, the demand floor erodes. And demand erosion of this kind doesn't move linearly, it moves slowly, then all at once. As more transactions happen in yuan, as more bilateral oil deals bypass dollar clearing, as more central banks reduce their dollar reserve holdings, each step makes the next step slightly easier for the next country to take. The network effect that built dollar dominance works in reverse when the network starts to fray. This is not a crisis that announces itself with a single dramatic event. It is a slow geological shift, and the tanker strikes, the drone war, the diplomatic statement about Iranian oil, the quiet back-channel deals, all of these are contributing pressure to a tectonic fault line that has been building stress for years. Step back from the immediate events and think about the structural problem America now faces, because it is genuinely novel in the post-war era, and it doesn't have an obvious solution. American leadership of the international order was never purely about military capability. It was about credibility. The belief, held by allies and rivals alike, that American power would be exercised reliably, effectively, and at acceptable cost. That belief was a deterrent in itself. Countries, including countries with genuine grievances against US foreign policy, did not challenge American dominance not primarily because they lacked the desire to, but because the expected outcome of challenge was swift and catastrophic defeat. The deterrent was the perception of invincibility, and the perception was self-sustaining as long as it wasn't seriously tested. Iran has tested it. Not in a way that constitutes a military defeat for the United States. The US military remains, by conventional measures, the most powerful force in human history. But in a way that has demonstrated publicly and verifiably that challenging American military systems in this specific theater carries meaningful probability of success. And that demonstration is being watched and analyzed by every government on Earth. The countries most alarmed by this development are not America's enemies, they are America's allies, because the security guarantees that underpin the entire alliance architecture, the commitments to defend partners, to keep sea lanes open, to maintain stable energy flows, those guarantees derive their value from the belief that they can be delivered. When that belief is complicated by evidence from the Strait, allies face a choice. They can double down on the American security relationship and hope the evidence is anomalous, or they can begin quietly diversifying their security options, building alternative relationships, reducing dependence on a single guarantor whose reliability is now statistically less certain than it was 3 years ago. They are choosing the latter, not loudly, not as a dramatic act of defiance, but as prudent institutional risk management. Countries that host American military bases are expanding diplomatic ties with China. Countries that depend on American security guarantees are increasing domestic defense spending rather than free-riding as they once did. Countries that relied on American financial architecture are increasing the share of their reserves held in non-dollar assets. Each of these decisions is rational from the perspective of the individual country making it. Collectively, they add up to a structural weakening of the American-led order that no single policy decision can reverse. This is not a crisis caused by one administration. It would be a mistake, a politically convenient but analytically dishonest mistake. to frame this as the product of any particular presidency or any particular set of decisions. The structural pressures that produced this moment have been building across multiple administrations, multiple Congresses, multiple strategic cycles. The choices that matter now are not about assigning blame for the past. They are about navigating a transition whose contours are still being determined. Washington's call for international partners to join in asserting collective control over Hormuz-adjacent energy resources has encountered a specific, revealing, and almost entirely underreported obstacle. The partners didn't come. Countries that once quietly aligned with American strategic objectives without public announcement, countries that depend on American military systems, that host American bases, that have deep and long-standing security and economic ties to the United States, these countries are not rallying to this position. Some are publicly silent. Some are privately distancing themselves. Some are actively accelerating economic diversification strategies that reduce their exposure to both the American-Iranian confrontation and the American financial system more broadly. This is not defiance in the traditional sense. These are not countries making bold declarations of independence or pivoting dramatically to an anti-American posture. What they are doing is subtler and ultimately more consequential. They are quietly recalibrating risk. They are looking at the evidence from the Strait, listening to the public statements about Iranian oil, watching the back-channel yuan-denominated transactions multiply, and making the institutional judgment that concentration risk in the American security and financial system has become elevated. Insurance, diversification, hedging. The fact that America's partners feel the need to take out that kind of insurance is itself a signal. It says something about the confidence they have in the guarantee, and it creates a feedback loop. As partners hedge, American leverage over those partners decreases. As American leverage decreases, the cost of maintaining the alliance architecture increases. As costs increase and benefits decline, the domestic political pressure in the United States to reduce overseas commitments grows. And as that pressure grows, partners hedge more. The logic is self-reinforcing in the wrong direction. Some Gulf states that have historically maintained energy infrastructure at near maximum capacity, acting as the world's emergency petroleum reserves, providing the buffer that dampens price spikes during supply disruptions, are now making different calculations. Reviewing long-term supply contracts, reducing output from processing facilities in some cases, reassessing the wisdom of being the world's energy insurance policy, while their own region becomes a contested conflict zone. These decisions are rational, but their downstream effects fall hardest not on the countries doing the contesting. They fall on energy importing economies in Europe, North America, and Asia. There is a layer of this story that rarely makes it into the geopolitical analysis, a layer that is arguably the most important one. What this means for ordinary people, not strategists, not policymakers, not energy traders running hedged positions in futures markets, the families who will pay for all of this without ever understanding why their bills went up. In the United Kingdom, energy prices have already been a source of profound and lasting economic trauma. The cost of living crisis that dominated British political life through the early 2020s was substantially driven by energy price volatility. The memory of that crisis, the food bank queues, the people choosing between heating and eating, the businesses closing because they couldn't absorb utility costs, is still fresh. Any further disruption to Gulf oil and gas supply will not stay in the financial press. It will show up in household energy bills by the end of the next billing cycle. It will show up in the price of goods at the supermarket. It will fuel a political conversation about why ordinary families are absorbing the costs of decisions made by governments and military planners thousands of miles away. In the United States, the political sensitivity to petrol prices is almost without parallel in democratic politics. Americans drive long distances as a structural feature of how their country is built. Petrol prices are not an abstract economic indicator. They are a daily, visible, unavoidable reminder of economic conditions. Every president who has presided over sustained high energy costs has faced the political consequences. The tension between assertive foreign policy in the Gulf and domestic economic stability is not theoretical. It is a hard political constraint that shapes every decision about how far to escalate and at what cost. In Canada, where significant portions of the national economy are tied to energy production and export, global oil price dynamics directly shape provincial revenues, employment levels in the energy sector, and federal fiscal capacity. Alberta's budget, the fortunes of the country's major energy producers, the employment outlook in communities whose entire economic identity is built around resource extraction, all of these are directly affected by what happens in a narrow strait on the other side of the world. And then there is a dimension that carries a weight entirely different from economic calculation. Reports emerged of American military personnel missing in theater, aircraft potentially lost, the human beings inside those aircraft, service members who took an oath, who went through years of training, who said goodbye to families before deploying to a region where the rules of engagement were evolving faster than anyone fully understood. The grief and uncertainty experienced by families waiting for news about missing personnel does not live in government briefings or strategic assessments. It lives in homes in small towns in Georgia and Texas and Ohio that have almost no connection to the policy debates happening in Washington. That weight, the weight of individual lives inside these macro-level strategic confrontations, is the part of the story that gets compressed into a footnote and deserves to be much more than that. Here's the counterintuitive reality sitting at the center of everything described above. The United States spent decades building an international order on a foundational premise: that challenging American power was pointless, not merely costly, pointless. The expected outcome of serious challenge was defeat so overwhelming and swift that the attempt itself was deterrence against future attempts. That premise was self-reinforcing. It didn't need to be tested constantly because the memory of the tests that had failed was sufficient. That premise has now been partially tested in the Gulf. The results are not catastrophic for the United States. This is not 1940 France, and anyone drawing that comparison is being reckless with historical analogy. The United States retains extraordinary military capability, a global intelligence network of unmatched reach, nuclear deterrence, deep alliance relationships, and the world's largest economy. None of that has evaporated. But power is not simply what you have. Power is what others believe you can and will use effectively. And in the specific context of the Gulf, in the specific domain of drone warfare and asymmetric naval pressure and financial system alternatives, the perception of American invincibility has taken a measurable, documented, globally observed hit. The implications compound. When more actors conclude that testing American resolve carries meaningful probability of partial success, more actors test it. When more tests occur, the cost of responding to all of them simultaneously rises. When costs rise, choices have to be made about where to respond and where to absorb. When choices are made, the countries that weren't prioritized draw their own conclusions. The credibility erosion is not a single event. It is a process. And processes of this kind, once they have enough momentum, are historically very difficult to reverse without a dramatic and costly demonstration of capability that comes with its own risks of escalation. Renegotiations of the international order. Who sets the rules? Who enforces them? At what cost? With what legitimacy? Have throughout history rarely been clean or quiet transitions. The shift from British to American dominance in the mid-20th century came through the trauma of 2 world wars and an economic depression. The transition from the bipolar Cold War order to the unipolar American moment came through the sudden implosion of the Soviet state, a relatively rare instance of a major power transition without direct great power conflict. There is no historical precedent that suggests the current transition, whatever its ultimate shape, will be smoother than its predecessors. What is almost certain is that we are in the window that historians later identify as the inflection point. Not at the end of a story, but inside it, at the moment where the outcome is still genuinely uncertain, where the choices made in the next months and years will determine whether the transition is managed towards something stable, or whether it accelerates through miscalculation into something far more dangerous. The Strait of Hormuz is not just a shipping lane, it is a referendum on the global order. Every tanker that passes through it unimpeded is a vote for the continuation of the existing system. Every tanker that burns is a vote for its revision. Every yuan-denominated oil deal is a vote for an alternative architecture. Every military asset compromised, every insurance premium raised, every partner quietly hedging is a vote being cast by actors who are not waiting for Washington to resolve its internal debates about how to respond. Iran has made a calculated and sustained bet that the cost of maintaining American dominance in the Gulf exceeds the political and economic will of American leadership to pay it. The evidence so far does not suggest that bet is losing, and the countries watching this from a distance, not enemies, not allies, but the vast middle of the international system that has always aligned with whoever they believed would win, are updating their assessments accordingly. What comes next is not written. Washington can recalibrate, finding a way to demonstrate resolve without triggering the escalation spiral that everyone with a clear strategic mind wants desperately to avoid. Tehran can overplay its hand, pushing a confrontation that unifies the international community in a way that fractures its current support structure. The countries caught in the middle can find arrangements that reduce their exposure, or they can find themselves trapped, forced to choose between great powers in a situation where neither choice is safe. History offers no guarantees about which of those paths gets taken. It offers only this, in windows like this one, in moments when old rules are losing their grip and new ones haven't yet been established. The gap between what decision-makers believe is happening and what is actually happening is at its most dangerous. Miscalculation in that gap has, before, produced consequences that reshaped the world in ways no one anticipated and no one wanted. We are in that gap right now, and the question worth sitting with, the question that should inform how you read the next headline about a tanker fire or a missing aircraft or a yuan-denominated oil deal, is not whether American power is real. It is whether the system built around that power is durable enough to survive the sustained test it is currently facing. The answer to that question will not be announced. It will be revealed slowly, in shipping data and insurance rates and reserve currency compositions and alliance decisions, and the quiet conversations of governments who are deciding, right now, which side of history they want to be on when the transition becomes undeniable. That is the story happening inside the story you're being shown, and it matters more than almost anything else being discussed in the world today.